Michael Embry, and welcome to our first program featuring the 34th Kentucky Book Fair. Now, if you haven't marked the Kentucky Book Fair on your calendar, do so now. It's going to be November the 14th at the Frankfort Convention Center. It starts at 9 o'clock in the morning and it runs until 4:30 p.m. in the afternoon. As many of you know, the Kentucky Book Fair is the state's premier literary event. It's an annual celebration of reading and writing. And this year we'll have more than 200 authors and illustrators attending the fair. Some of the authors will be, we'll have three of Kentucky's poet laureates, including the current one, George Ella Lyon, and past laureates, Frank X. Walker and Richard Taylor. Wendell Berry will be there signing his book, Our Only World, 10 Essays, and he'll have some other titles there as well. He's one of our most popular authors. James Archambault, a perennial favorite with his calendars and his postcards, he'll be there as well. Some other noteworthy folks will be Congressman Steve Israel from New York. He wrote a kind of a satire novel, The Global War on Morris. Cheryl Della Pietra, she worked for Hunter S. Thompson, the legendary Hunter S. Thompson, back in the early 90s. And she's written a fictional account of that called Gonzo Girl. Sally Bingham will be there with her book, 3 Letters. Sharon McCrum with her book, Nora Bonestill's Christmas Past. Peter Slevin, who wrote a biography of Michelle Obama. Davis Miller, whose book is Approaching Ali, a reclamation in 3 acts about Muhammad Ali. Robert Crane, his book is Sex, Celebrity, and My Father's Unsolved Murder. Robert Crane, his dad was Bob Crane from Hogan's Heroes. David Joy, Where All the Lights Tend to Go, one of the one of the more popular fiction titles in 2015. John Temple, his book is American Pain, How a Young Felon and His Crew of Doctors Unleashed the Deadliest Drug Epidemic in U.S. History. And it's about the drug epidemic involving Kentucky, Florida, the drug pipeline. So it's got very good reviews nationwide. Also, on November 13th, we're going to have Kids and Teens Day, and more than 40 authors will be there. It runs from 9 o'clock in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Marsha Thornton Jones, Nancy Carlson, Debbie Deddy, and quite a few others will be there. So it's a big event. We'll have 600 or 700 students from area high schools. The Kentucky Book Fair includes readings, symposiums, and presentations, but you can learn all about it if you go to kybookfair.blogspot.com, and you can also find Kentucky Book Fair on Facebook. So when you go there, be sure and like it, and you'll be getting all the updates from there as well. Now today we have 3 very popular authors, Dr. Cotton McDaniel, Abigail Keam, and Steve Demaree. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Be here.
Karen, tell us about your book. Now, what is the book that you contributed on?
Our book is the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia. It is the first book in the country to be devoted to the actual life and culture of an African American population of that state. We've had 150 authors contribute to the volume. It has more than 141 photographs, over 600 pages. It weighs 4.7 pounds. It has a number of topical essays on issues such as women, the Eastern Kentucky coal fields. Mm-hmm. There's a topical entry on organizations, education, and business. So those are the topical ones.
Now, back in the early 90s, there was the Kentucky Encyclopedia.
Yes.
Is this kind of an outgrowth of that?
There was the Kentucky Encyclopedia, then the Louisville Encyclopedia,
Okay.
the Northern Kentucky, and Kentucky African American Encyclopedia is the last of the encyclopedias, according to the press.
Okay. Now, that's did a little research, and I remember back in 2012, was that when it actually started, or before then?
It started way before then. My initial proposal to the press was in 2003.
Okay.
Then we did some revisions, and first they lost it, but then we did some revisions and resubmitted, and in 2007 we actually launched the program, the project. We launched it at University of Kentucky and then at Eastern Kentucky University, yes.
I would imagine that, how many pages is it?
It's over 600.
Over 600, and you, over 150 authors?
150
writers.
authors and 1,155 entries.
That takes a lot of work, doesn't
It's
it?
a lot of work. We're fortunate to have the 150 authors.
Well, I understand you have, Gerald Smith from UK and John
UK,
Harden.
John Harden,
They're
yes.
co-editors.
Co-editors, yes.
Now, how did you all, did the three of you sit down and kind of break this up into different topics and who's going to oversee something, or?
Well, I initiated the project when I was at K-State, and wanted to do a biographical encyclopedia. But after talking with the press, we decided to expand it and include people, not just people, but places, events, organizations, movements, those kinds of things. So as a group, the three of us, we did sit down, talk about where we wanted to go, but we didn't divide the topics up. We literally, with all our research, each of us had our own research projects that we were working on. So we just started making lists of what should be in there, and we'd pull them together, and so many of them were duplicates, of course, but just fine-tuning it, and then we ended up getting what we called an advisory board of other scholars, not just in Kentucky, like George Wright, who used to be in Kentucky, who had written 3 volumes on Kentucky African Americans. So with those people, we had additional entries that were added to the list, and fine-tuned it, and we did focus on, some of us focused on particular things that we wanted to include. Like, I was very interested in women being included, because a lot of encyclopedias, a lot of projects fail to include women in their history. So there are over 200 entries that are about women or their organizations.
You know, of course, I think the book is long overdue. Did it ever seem like it was a never-ending project? I mean, once you get into it, I mean, the more you uncover, there's still more to uncover.
Well, that one of the interesting pieces is the women piece, because I was working on my dissertation at the time, at the late age, but and it was about women. So my dissertation kept feeding entries to the encyclopedia. So it was the two things, working together for me. It was a very positive approach to it. I didn't think it was not endless. I knew there was an end to it, and each week there was more and more progress, and we were very confident that it would be completed.
When I assume you had a deadline for when people had to have their entries or whatever in. Did everybody kind of meet those?
No.
No, I didn't think so.
No, the deadline, we had the deadlines initially, and we were going to do it in 5 years. I mean, like the other encyclopedias, 5 years. Nobody completed them in 5 years. And we weren't any different. But we did have deadlines. And when I was at Eastern Kentucky University, I had some faculty that I pulled in and did different little symposiums with them to get faculty engaged in the project. And some of them met the deadlines, and some of them didn't. Some of them still haven't met them.
Right.
But we end up doing the entries ourselves. If they're, the people who sign up for them don't follow through, it's not an issue. We just go ahead and get them done. We had a lot of graduate assistants with us at UK and EKU and Western Kentucky, where John is. And so those students helped us with initially, doing some of the research and everything. So,
Well, of course, it's a beautiful reference book, but it's more than just a reference book, isn't it? I mean, it's just some fascinating facts in there, right?
Fascinating facts, fascinating people. There were people I learned about as we were doing it, doing the process. It's a good reference book for anyone, even from elementary school on up, because for elementary school, of course, it would give them the basic information. For colleges and scholars, there are references at the end of each one of the entries. So if you did some research I want to do some research on someone, that's a good starting point. So. Yeah, we're very proud of it. We talk about it as our legacy to our grandchildren.
Oh,
so,
yes.
So.
How often do you use it?
I use it all the time.
Okay.
Yes.
Now you're a former librarian.
Former library director at Kentucky State.
You were there what, about 15, 16 years, or
I was library director for over 16 years, I think.
And you were what,
yeah.
an academic librarian?
I was an academic librarian first. Then I went to the law. I was a law librarian at the Department of Public Advocacy. Then I went to the State Archives, and I was a librarian there, and then an archivist. And then back at Kentucky State as the director of libraries. And after I retired, I started another career. I started teaching at EKU, and then I taught at Berea for those 4 years at those two schools.
Well, I thought one thing really kind of fascinating is that we've mentioned it already, is that you were working on your PhD while doing this.
Yes,
so it's how did you find the time?
I've got good time management skills.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And when I got tired of one of them, it just drove me crazy, then I would go to the other one.
Well, another thing too, you being a librarian, was it always a desire to, hey, I want to have my book in the shelves too someday?
Well, I was doing a lot of writing for other people's encyclopedias in other states and stuff. They weren't specific to the black population. A lot of them weren't, but. As I was doing some once for this lady who did notable black American men and notable black American women, Jessie Smith at Fisk, I thought, I would only pick the Kentucky entries. So as I was doing the Kentucky entries, I said, I should just pull these together and do my own encyclopedia. And so that was the proposal that I had submitted to the University Press, was to do one just on people. And you know what your constituents need, what your students need, and there was always a desire and from students to find information on Kentuckians when they were Black History Month, but throughout the year. So this was a need that I saw and tried to fill it.
And you're working on a book now, right?
I'm working on one that's related to my dissertation, which looks at the activism of club women in Kentucky before the modern civil rights movement.
When do you see a publication date for that?
2017 at the latest.
Okay, so we'll have you at the book fair then, right?
I hope so.
And well, listen, Karen, I appreciate you being here, and I'm looking forward to reading that book. I think it just sounds really very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the program.
Okay. And our next author is Abigail Keam, and she's from Lexington. And you've written quite a few books, haven't you?
Yes, I'm working on my 19th one.
And the book you're going to have is what? Death by Derby.
Death by Derby is a Josiah Reynolds mystery.
And what's it about? I assume there's a Derby connection in it.
Well,
right?
it's a Derby connection, yeah. It's a mysteries around the Derby. They think someone's dead, but actually, well, I can't go into it. But I started writing these books because I was tired of reading books where all the protagonists were young and they were solving crimes when they're during breaks in business. And I wrote about an older woman who was bitter, and she had severe health problems, and she was very sarcastic, and she drank, and I just thought, well, yeah, this is somebody I'd like to meet. So I wrote, and the story, there's always a little standalone mystery, but it's also about her life, and that storyline continues through all the 8 books in the series.
And, Josiah, I mean, that's
a male name.
Male name.
She was named after King Josiah in the Bible by her grandmother. Her grandmother's very religious, and Josiah's a Southern Baptist, and she's always quoting from the Bible. Not that she's religious herself; she just quotes things. And
and I understand you started writing in 2010.
Well, I published my first book in 2010, but I've always written since I was a child. And in fact, I have a fantasy series that I wrote in the 90s, which I published in 2012.
Okay, is that
That's the Princess Mara Tales.
Magella?
Yeah.
Okay, Magella Family Series.
Yeah.
And, there's 4 books in that?
There's 4, and the 5th one's coming out next year.
Okay, so that's been your latest project then?
My latest project, yeah.
And,
I juggle. I write 3 different series, and I juggle about 3 books. I write 3 books at the same time. It kind of makes me a little crazy.
Well,
A little twitchy.
well, the Magilla series, is that young adult, or is that for everyone?
It's
or?
for everyone, but I would say young girls would like to read it. I would say
Okay.
specifically young girls, but anybody can read it. I have adults reading it.
When most of your books are females the protagonists?
Yes.
Okay, and on top of that, you've written what, 2 romance?
I have 3 romance. The
3
4th
romance.
is coming out next month.
Okay.
And they're just little novella romance books about Key Largo and a motel where people go and they find love at this motel, or they renew their life at this motel.
That's the
Last Chance Motel series.
Okay. And are you going to have that book at the book fair?
No, I will just have 3 of the Josiah Reynolds mysteries at the book fair.
Okay.
It'll be Death by Haunting, Death by Derby, and Death by Chocolate.
Okay. And I was going to ask you, it's I mean, your titles are pretty catchy. All the like Death by Chocolate and Death by a Honeybee. Is that one?
The first one was Death by a Honeybee. I'm a
Okay.
beekeeper.
Okay.
And I made my living by being a beekeeper for many years. Josiah Reynolds is a beekeeper. So I also put a lot of beekeeping information in the books, a lot of histories interwoven, Southern histories interwoven in the books, because Josiah is definitely a Southern woman. And I try to make them funny and attempt to make them witty if I can. I think they're witty. And just talk about life in Lexington. They take place in Lexington, and they seem to have caught on really well. I mean, I have people from all over the world emailing me and said, I never knew life in Kentucky was like that. Because I talk about bluegrass, which is a different culture than what most people see through the media.
Is the beekeeper thing, is that through each novel? I mean,
Yes,
is there some reference to beekeeping?
In each
Okay.
novel.
So you got a little niche there with the beekeepers around the world, don't you?
Yes,
I
I
hope
couldn't
so.
have written these books if I hadn't done beekeeping. I could not have written these books. That character, the way she talks about bees and nature and how everything interconnects, that's very important to these books. And if I hadn't become a beekeeper and worked at the Lexington Farmers Market, which I did for 10 years, I never could have done these books.
Well, I understand you've won 16 awards at the state fair.
16 beekeeping awards, yeah, at the state fair for honey.
So is that a
So I know honey, I know bees.
Well, one other thing then is should be concerned about the bee population.
Absolutely. I
Okay.
mean,
Put your plug in
even
here.
President Obama is getting a study group because our bees are dying around the world, not just here in the United States, but around the world. And, they produce 1/3 of our food. And if we don't have the honeybee, we don't keep a strong supply of honeybees around our fields, we're not going to have apples or pears or plums or any of those nice little goodies.
Well, we'll keep that in mind.
That's why we need to support beekeepers and buy local honey.
We'll do. And buy local authors too, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, thanks, Abigail. You've been to the book, one other thing, you've been to the book fair several times, right?
Yes,
What do you like about the book fair?
Well, I like talking to the people. I like talking to the readers. They're very avid. Kentucky has a huge devoted reading population. They're there. They're very supportive. The facility is very nice. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And I also like going around meeting the new authors. I was there the year Alan Eckert was there, who wrote The Frontiersman, and I was a big fan of his, and he has since passed away, but just to meet him, I was thrilled. I'm a big fan of authors, I get starstruck just like anybody else. I met Sue Grafton there, and it's just thrilling to to have an opportunity to talk to fellow writers.
Well, like I said, we're going to have over 200 this year, so you'll have a lot of folks.
I'll be table hopping.
Okay. Well, thanks, Abigail, for being with us. And our third guest is Steve Demaree from Lexington. Welcome,
Good to be
Steve.
here.
And you've written 23 books?
23. Just finished my 23rd, and about 2 weeks I'll start the 24th.
And what's your latest title?
Well, the one at the book fair is Murder on a Blind Date.
Okay.
And that is the 9th book in my cozy mystery series of Sidecker and Lou Murdoch.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my most popular series. I've written 4 series altogether, but that is the...
Well, your Decker Cozy series, do they all start with murder? Like murder, murder at a book fair?
They pretty much, have something in the title of murder in every title. The first one is 52 Steps to Murder. Some of them have murder first, some have last. Mm-hmm. I won't tell you what it is yet, but the 10th one that I'll be starting in a couple of weeks doesn't actually have murder in it, but you can tell from the title that it is a murder.
Uh-huh.
And they're just good old-fashioned whodunits. Mm-hmm. And a lot of humor in it. People tell me they love my characters. Mm-hmm. They love my detectives, the fact that they're not perfect. They love the humor in the book. They love the fact they have no profanity, sex, or graphic violence, mm-hmm. and that they're hard to figure out whodunits.
Uh-huh. Now, your first book came out when?
2000.
In 2000.
Mm-hmm.
Now, was that?
That was a book of inspirational short stories.
Okay.
And my first 3 books were that. I had no idea at that time that I'd write anything other than inspirational short stories, and mm-hmm. I figured maybe I might write 6 books and quit. Mm-hmm. And it was later I had another series before I even started writing a murder mystery, but I've always, from the time I was a child, I've always been fascinated with whodunits and mm-hmm. figuring things out. Whether it's murder mysteries or game shows, I love figuring things out.
I thought it was a little surprising. For a guy who does whodunits, you've written some Christian romance as well.
Yeah, it's hard to identify what that is. I don't know what I write, but it's more humor than it is Christian. It's more humor than it is romance. What people tell me that love the series, and that's the book that'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. But that series, people just say it's a neighborhood that they wish they could live in. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, my hero was Pollyanna. I like good stuff. Uh-huh. And